He rescued an alien outcast. Then her blood heat ignited. Elias Eli. Calderon wiped the grease from his hands with a rag, so stained it barely made a difference. The motion was automatic, honed by years of coaxing life back into rusted engines and busted transmissions. Out here in Nevada desert, the air smelled of dust and diesel, and the only sounds were the hum of a flickering neon sign above his workshop door. Calderon's fixes open when I feel like it, and the occasional howl of wind cutting through the cracked windows. It was past midnight, the kind of hour where the world felt too still, too empty. He tossed the rag onto a cluttered workbench and squinted at the horizon, where the moon hung low, casting a pale silver glow over the endless stretch of sand and sagebrush. 3 years ago, Eli had been somebody else. A mechanical engineer on an offshore oil rig, barking orders over the roar of machinery, his hands steady even when the storms hit. Then came the explosion, a valve failure, a fireball that swallowed half his crew, and a corporate scapegoat named Elias Calderon. The paycheck stopped, the guilt didn't. So he'd retreated here, to this crumbling relic of a repair shop off Highway 50, fixing trucks for the rare drivers who dared the loneliest road in America. It wasn't much, but it was his, a sanctuary of solitude where the past couldn't find him. He stretched, his back popping from hours hunched over a semi's carburetor, and reached for the dented coffee pot simmering on a hot plate. The brew was bitter, thick as tar, but it kept the ghosts at bay. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose sheet metal on the roof. Eli ignored it, sipping his coffee, until a new sound cut through the night, a low, metallic groan, like something heavy had just kissed the earth too hard. He set the mug down, ears straining. It wasn't a truck backfiring or a coyote knocking over trash. This was different, bigger. Grabbing a flashlight from the bench, he stepped out into the cool desert air, the beams slicing through the darkness. The sound had come from the west, maybe a mile or two out, where the dunes rose like frozen waves. Against his better judgment, because out here, curiosity usually meant trouble, he climbed into his battered Jeep, the engine coughing to life with a reluctant growl. The tires crunched over gravel as he drove toward the source, the moonlight painting eerie shadows across the sand. He crested a low ridge and slammed on the brakes. There, half buried in a crater of scorched earth, was something that didn't belong. A sleek, arrow-shaped craft, its hull shimmering like liquid mercury, smoked faintly where it had gouged the desert floor. It wasn't a plane, not with those curves and that strange, pulsing glow along its edges. Eli's pulse quickened, a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. He'd seen wrecks before, semis flipped on black ice, rigs torn apart by storms. But this was no human machine. He killed the engine and approached on foot, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The craft's surface was warm to the touch, vibrating with a faint hum that buzzed through his bones. A jagged tear ran along its side, exposing a dark interior. "Anyone alive in there?" he called, voice rough from disuse. No answer, just the wind whispering secrets he couldn't decode. Then a soft rustle, a movement inside. Eli tightened his grip on the flashlight, wishing he'd brought the crowbar from the Jeep. He leaned closer, peering through the gash, and froze. A figure slumped against the inner wall, humanoid but unmistakably other. Her skin gleamed like polished silver under the beam, catching the light in a way that made it dance. Long black hair spilled over her shoulders, slick and glossy as an oil spill, framing a face too perfect to be real. High cheekbones, a sharp jaw, and lips parted in shallow breaths. Her eyes fluttered open, and Eli's breath caught. They were blue, impossibly deep, like staring into the heart of a glacier, with pupils that flickered like starlight. "You're human," she whispered, her voice a melody wrapped in exhaustion, strange and lilting. She shifted, wincing, and he saw it. A gash across her shoulder, oozing a shimmering green fluid that glowed faintly in the dark. Blood, he guessed, but not like any he'd ever seen. Last time I checked, he managed his throat dry. "You hurt bad. Can you move?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear, or recognition passing through them. "Help me," she said, barely audible, her hand reaching out before trembling and falling limp. Then she swayed, her body folding like a marionette with cut strings. Instinct kicked in, years of pulling injured rig workers from wreckage, and Eli dropped the flashlight, lunging forward to catch her. She was lighter than she looked, her frame delicate yet firm under his hands. But her skin burned against his, hotter than the desert sun at noon, sending a jolt through him that wasn't just surprise. He stumbled back, cradling her against his chest, and her head lolled against his shoulder. Up close, her scent hit him, something wild and sweet, like sage after rain mixed with a hint of something electric, unplaceable. His heart thudded harder, an unfamiliar heat creeping up his neck as her hair brushed his jaw. "Shit," he muttered, glancing around the empty desert. No headlights, no sirens, just the two of them and this impossible wreck. Whatever she was, leaving her here wasn't an option. Not with that wound, not with the way her presence was already tugging at something deep inside him. He carried her back to the Jeep, her body pressed against his, every point of contact sparking a strange warmth that made his hands unsteady. He laid her across the passenger seat, her silver skin glinting under the dashboard lights, and floored it back to the shop. The workshop door creaked as he kicked it open, carrying her inside and setting her down on the old steel workbench he'd cleared earlier. Tools clattered to the floor, forgotten. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, that green blood seeping through the tear in her strange, form-fitting suit, some kind of armor, maybe, though it hugged her curves like a second skin. Eli grabbed his first aid kit from a shelf, hands moving on autopilot, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. The way her hair fanned out across the metal, the faint shimmer of her skin, the subtle rise of her chest. It was hypnotic, pulling at him in ways he couldn't explain. "Hey," he said, shaking himself out of it. "You with me? I'm going to patch you up, but I need you to stay awake." He reached for the antiseptic, but her hand shot up, weak but insistent, closing around his wrist. Her touch was fire, a pulse of heat that raced up his arm and settled low in his gut. Those blue eyes locked onto his, sharp now despite her pain. "No poison," she murmured, her accent curling around the words like smoke. "Water, clean water." Her grip tightened for a moment, then slipped away as she sank back, exhausted. Eli nodded, swallowing hard. "Water. Got it." He grabbed a canteen from the sink, his mind spinning. Alien, fugitive, whatever she was, this was beyond him. But as he knelt beside her, pouring water onto a clean cloth, he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just dragged him into something bigger than the secondly. The heat radiating off her wasn't just from her wound. It was her. And it was intoxicating. Eli Calderon knelt beside the workbench, the canteen trembling slightly in his hand as he poured water onto a clean shop rag. The workshop's dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows across the steel surface where the strange woman lay. Her silver skin seemed to drink in the light, reflecting it back in soft pulses that danced along her arms and chest. He pressed the damp cloth to the gash on her shoulder, careful not to press too hard, though her faint hiss told him even that was enough to sting. That shimmering green blood, emerald-like and glowing, mixed with the water, congealing faster than it should have. He'd seen oil spills clot on rig decks, but this was something else entirely. "You're going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to her, his voice rough from hours of silence. "Just hang in there." Her eyes, those deep blue pools flecked with starlight, flickered toward him, hazy but alert. She didn't speak, just watched him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Up close, she was even more unreal, her features sharp yet soft, like a sculpture carved from moonlight. Her suit, torn at the shoulder, clung to her like liquid metal, outlining every curve with a precision that made it hard to focus on the task at hand. He cleared his throat, forcing his eyes back to the wound. "Name's Eli, by the way. Elias Calderon. Figure you oughta know who's patching you up." He dabbed at the cut again, the green blood slowing to a trickle. "You got one? A name, I mean." Her lips parted, a faint shimmer playing across them as she exhaled. Kaeris, she said, the word rolling off her tongue like a song, smooth and foreign. Kaeris Tlyra. She paused, her gaze sharpening as if testing him. You are kind, Eli Calderon. Kind's a stretch, he muttered, setting the cloth aside to rummage through his first aid kit for gauze. Just don't like seeing someone bleed out on my table. Bad for business. He found a roll, tore off a strip with his teeth, and started wrapping her shoulder. Her skin was hot under his fingers, feverish, and every brush sent a jolt through him, like static, but deeper, sinking into his bones. He gritted his teeth, trying to ignore it. So, Kaeris Tlyra, you want to tell me why a woman with glowing blood crash-landed in my backyard? She shifted slightly, wincing as the gauze tightened, and her hair spilled over the edge of the bench, black and glossy as a raven's wing. I am fleeing, she said, her voice low, deliberate. From Thrun, my home. There was war, betrayal. Her eyes darkened, the starlight in them dimming. My family ruled there. Now they are dead, and I am hunted. Eli paused, the gauze half-tied, his mind racing. Hunted? By who? He glanced toward the workshop's grimy windows, half expecting headlights or worse to pierce the desert night. In Thrun, that's not anywhere I've heard of. Were you some kind of astronaut? Her lips curved, a ghost of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Not your stars. Mean it. She gestured weakly toward the ceiling, as if pointing beyond it. Thrun is far. Another world. I am its last princess. The words hit him like a wrench to the chest. Alien. She was an alien. He'd half guessed it from the ship, the blood, the way she looked, but hearing it out loud made the room tilt. He tied off the gauze, hands steadier than his thoughts, and leaned back on his heels. Princess, huh? So I've got royalty bleeding green all over my shop. That's a new one. You doubt me, she said, not a question. Her head tilted, studying him, and the motion made her hair slide across her chest, drawing as I despite himself. I do not blame you, but my hunters, they will come. They are not kind. Great, he muttered, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. Just what I need. More trouble. He stood, pacing to the sink to wash the green stains from his hands, though the heat from her touch lingered like a brand. Look, I'll keep you here tonight. Get you patched up, figure this out. But I'm no hero, Kaeris. I fix engines, not intergalactic messes. She didn't respond, just watched him with that unnerving gaze, her breathing shallow but steady. He turned back to her, leaning against the sink, arms crossed. You need anything else? Food. More water. Rest, she said softly. And safety. Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment, then snapped open, brighter than before. You give me both, Eli Calderon. For now. He nodded, unsure what else to say, and dragged an old cot from the corner of the shop, setting it up near the workbench. Sleep here. I'll take the chair. He grabbed a blanket, threadbare but clean, and draped it over her as she eased onto the cot. Her suit shifted with the movement, revealing more of that silver skin, smooth and flawless, and he turned away fast, heart thudding. Whatever she was trouble wrapped in something too damn distracting. The next morning came too soon, the sun blazing through the workshop's cracked windows and turning the air thick with heat. Eli woke stiff in the folding chair, his neck screaming from the awkward angle. Kaeris was still on the cot, curled under the blanket, her breathing even. He studied her for a moment, the way her hair fanned out like ink against the gray fabric, the faint shimmer of her skin even in sleep. She looked less fragile now, the wound on her shoulder already scabbing over with a thin, iridescent layer. Too fast, too strange. He brewed another pot of coffee, the gurgle of the machine filling the silence, and tried to think. Alien princess. Hunters. A crashed ship in the desert. It sounded like a bad sci-fi flick, but the proof was right there, sleeping 10 feet away. He needed answers, real ones, but pushing her too hard risked shutting her down. Or worse, pissing off whatever was after her. She stirred as he poured his first cup, her eyes blinking open, that blue cutting through the morning haze. You stayed, she said, sitting up slowly, the blanket slipping to her waist. The suit hugged her tighter in the daylight, and Eli's grip tightened on the mug. "Didn't have much choice," he said, taking a sip to steady himself. "You're not exactly in shape to run off yet." He nodded at her shoulder. "That's healing fast, though. Faster than it should." Kaeris glanced at the wound, tracing it with a finger, and the motion made the air hum faintly, like a tuning fork struck underwater. "My calm in quickly. But this," she hesitated, her hand dropping. "This is different. I feel unsteady." "Unsteady how?" He set the mug down, stepping closer despite the warning bells in his head. "You mean the crash?" "No." Her eyes met his, and something shifted in them, pupils dilating, the blue deepening. "My body, it is changing." She stood, the blanket falling away completely, and moved toward him with a grace that hadn't been there last night. Her steps were fluid, almost predatory, and the air between them thickened, charged with something he couldn't name. Eli froze, rooted to the spot as she closed the distance. She was shorter than him, but her presence filled the room, her scent, that wild, electric sweetness, flooding his senses. "Kaeris," he warned, voice low. "What's going on?" She stopped inches away, her head tilting as if listening to something he couldn't hear. "The blood heat," she said, the words heavy, deliberate. "It comes from my kind every few cycles. I need to bond, to survive." Her hand lifted, hovering over his chest, not touching but close enough that he felt the warmth radiating from her. "I did not expect it so soon." "Bond." He swallowed, his mouth dry despite the coffee. "Like what, marriage?" "Something else." His eyes flicked to her hand, then back to her face, where that blue gaze burned into him. "More," she whispered, her fingers brushing his shirt now, light as a feather but igniting a spark that raced through him. "A connection. Deep. Necessary." Her voice dropped, husky, wrapping around him like smoke. "I feel you, Eli Calderon. Your strength. Your heat." He stepped back, bumping into the workbench, tools clattering behind him. "Whoa, hold up. You're saying you're what in heat? And I'm the target." His laugh came out shaky, disbelief warring with the way his body was already responding, a low hum building in his chest where her fingers had grazed. "Not target," she corrected, stepping closer again, relentless. "Anchor." Her hand pressed fully against him now, palm flat over his heart, and the heat bloomed, spreading like wildfire. Her silver skin shimmered brighter, faint patterns, swirling, vein-like, pulsing beneath it. "Without this, I weaken. I burn." Eli's breath hitched, his hand instinctively grabbing her wrist to pull her away, but the contact only made it worse. Her skin was silk and flame, and the hum in his chest turned into a vibration, syncing with her pulse. "This is crazy," he rasped, but he didn't let go. Couldn't. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment he saw something raw, hunger, fear, longing, all tangled together. "Crazy," she echoed, her lips curving into that ghost of a smile. "But real." She leaned in, her breath warm against his jaw, and the world narrowed to the space between them. Her scent, her heat, the way her body seemed to call to his without words. Then the roar of an engine snapped him back. Tires crunched gravel outside, loud and close. Eli jerked away, heart pounding, and Kaeris tensed, her glow dimming slightly. He stumbled to the window, peering through the dust-streaked glass. A battered pickup rolled into the lot. Jimmy Reese, a local trucker who stopped by every few weeks for a tune-up. Harmless, but nosy as hell. "Shit," Eli muttered, turning back to Kaeris. "Someone's here. Stay down, keep quiet. I'll handle it." She nodded, sinking back onto the cot, but her eyes never left him, that blue burning with something he couldn't shake. As he headed for the door, wiping sweat from his brow, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever this blood heat was, it wasn't just her problem anymore. Eli yanked the workshop door open, the dry desert heat slapping him in the face as Jimmy Reese climbed out of his rusted pickup. The trucker was a wiry guy in his 50s, all sunburned skin and tobacco-stained teeth, his cap pulled low over squinting eyes. "Mornin', Calderon," Jimmy called, spitting into the dirt as he ambled over. Heard something weird last night. Big bang out west. You see anything? Eli forced a grin, leaning against the doorframe to block the view inside. Just the usual, Jimmy. Wind knocking crap around. You here for fix? His pulse hammered, Kayree's presence a live wire buzzing in the back of his mind. He could still feel her hand on his chest, that heat sinking into him like a promise he didn't ask for. Jimmy scratched his neck, peering past Eli toward the shop. Yeah, brakes are squealing again. But damn, man, you look jumpy. What's got you spooked? He took a step closer, and Eli shifted, widening his stance. Late night, Eli said, voice steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. Coffee's not kicking in yet. Pull her around back. I'll take a look. He jerked his thumb toward the side of the building, praying Jimmy wouldn't push it. The trucker shrugged, climbing back into his rig with a grunt. As the engine sputtered and the pickup rolled out of sight, Eli slipped back inside, shutting the door hard. Kayree was still on the cot, but she'd pulled herself upright, the blanket draped loosely over her lap. Her eyes tracked him, sharp and unblinking, and the air thickened again, that electric pull tugging at him. He's gone for now, Eli said, keeping his distance. But people talk around here. That crash wasn't quiet. Someone's going to come sniffing sooner or later. He ran a hand through his hair, the memory of her touch clawing at his focus. You said hunters. How long we got? Kayree stood, the blanket sliding to the floor, and Eli's breath caught. Her suit hugged her tighter in the morning light, the silver fabric shimmering with every move, outlining the curve of her hips, the dip of her waist. Not long, she said, stepping toward him, her voice a low hum that vibrated in his chest. They track my ship, my blood. She stopped close, too close, her scent wrapping around him, sweet and wild. But the heat, it grows stronger. I cannot hide it. Her hand lifted again, hovering near his face, and the air crackled faintly, a spark jumping between her fingers and his skin. You feel it too, she murmured, her blue eyes darkening. It calls to you. Eli clenched his jaw, stepping back. I feel something, yeah, but I'm not signing up for whatever this is. His voice cracked, betraying him, and her lips curved, knowing, dangerous. You already have, she said, soft as a secret, and the truth of it burned hotter than the desert sun. The day dragged on, the sun climbing high and turning the workshop into a furnace. Eli buried himself in Jimmy's brakes, wrench in hand, the clank of metal a lifeline to sanity. Kayree stayed inside, out of sight, but her presence lingered like a storm on the horizon, unseen but heavy, pressing against him. He caught her pacing earlier, her movements restless, fluid, like a cat stalking shadows. Every glance her way pulled him in deeper, her silver skin catching the light, her hair swaying like a dark tide, her eyes following him with a hunger he couldn't unsee. Jimmy left by noon, grumbling about the heat, but none the wiser, his truck rattling off down Highway 50. Eli wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping back into the shop, and found Kayree at the workbench, her fingers tracing the edge of a screwdriver as if it were a relic. She looked up, and the air shifted, thicker, warmer, charged with something alive. You're fidgety, he said, grabbing a water bottle from the fridge and tossing it to her. That heat thing, it's getting worse, isn't it? She caught the bottle midair, her reflexes too quick, and twisted the cap off with a slow, deliberate turn. Yes, she said, taking a sip, her lips glistening as she swallowed. The blood heat, it peaks soon. I cannot stop it. She set the bottle down and moved toward him, her steps silent on the concrete floor. You cannot stop it. Eli backed up, hitting the wall near the sink, the cold steel grounding him. I'm not doing this dance, Kayree. You're hurt. You're running. Focus on that. But his words felt hollow, drowned by the way she closed the gap, her body radiating heat he could feel through his shirt. I am focused, she said, her voice a velvet blade, cutting through his resolve. She stopped inches away, her head tilting, hair spilling over one shoulder like ink on silver. You are my focus, Eli Calderon. Her hand rose, brushing his chest again, and this time the spark wasn't subtle. It flared a pulse of warmth that sank deep, stirring something primal in his gut. "Jesus," he breathed, grabbing her wrist, but the contact only amplified it. Her skin was fire under his fingers, smooth and electric, and the patterns beneath it, those swirling, vein-like lines, glowed brighter, pulsing in time with his racing heart. "What are you doing to me?" "Not me," she whispered, leaning closer, her breath warm against his neck. "Us." Her free hand slid up his arm, fingers tracing the curve of his bicep, and the air hummed, a low vibration that matched the rhythm of her touch. "The heat binds us. You feel it here." She pressed her palm over his chest again, and he swore his heartbeat synced with hers, a drumbeat echoing through his bones. He should have pushed her away, should have locked her in the back room and called someone, anyone, to deal with this. But his hand tightened on her wrist instead, pulling her closer, and her gasp was a spark to dry tinder. Her body pressed against his, soft and unyielding, the suit molding to her like liquid silver. "Carice," he rasped, voice rough, "this ain't right." "It is," she countered, her lips hovering near his, so close he could taste the sweetness of her breath. "It is everything." Her eyes locked with his, blue and endless, and the world shrank to the heat between them, the pull he couldn't fight. Then a shadow flickered outside the window, a blur of movement, too fast for a coyote, too silent for a truck. Eli jerked back, senses snapping to alert, and Carice stiffened, her glow dimming. "They're here," she whispered, fear cutting through the haze in her voice. "The hunters." Eli shoved Carice behind him, his back pressing against her as he scanned the window. The shadow moved again, low, deliberate, a silhouette that didn't belong to the desert's usual scavengers. His hand shot to the workbench, grabbing a heavy wrench, the cold steel grounding him against the heat still simmering in his chest. "Stay back," he hissed, eyes darting to the door. "How many?" Carice's breath was hot against his neck, her body too close, too distracting. "3, maybe 4, she whispered, her voice tight but steady. "They are assassins, Tharun's best. Cloaked, silent." Her hand gripped his arm, fingers digging in, and the contact sent another jolt through him, sharp and electric. The patterns on her skin flared brighter, casting a faint glow across the room, and he cursed under his breath. She was a damn beacon. "Great," he muttered, edging toward the light switch. "Can't hide you if you're lighting up like a Christmas tree." He flicked it off, plunging the workshop into darkness, the only illumination now coming from her, those swirling, silver veins pulsing faster, brighter. Her glow painted the walls in eerie streaks, and he felt it too, a hum in his own skin, like her energy was bleeding into him. "Eli," she said, stepping closer, her voice a low purr despite the danger. "I cannot dim it. The heat, it grows with him near. With you." Her hand slid up his back, resting between his shoulder blades, and the warmth sank deep, coiling in his gut. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to turn around, to grab her, and focus. "Damn it. Stay put," he growled, shaking her off as he crept to the side door. He cracked it open, peering into the blazing afternoon light. The desert stretched empty before him, sand shimmering under the sun, but the hairs on his neck stood up. Something was out there, watching. He tightened his grip on the wrench, wishing he'd kept the shotgun from his rig days. A faint hiss broke the silence, like air leaking from a tire, but sharper, mechanical. Then the window behind him shattered, glass exploding inward as a figure dropped through, landing in a crouch. It was humanoid but wrong. Taller, leaner, its skin a dull gray mottled with jagged black markings. Red eyes glowed in a featureless face, and it held a sleek, curved blade that hummed with energy. Eli swung the wrench without thinking, aiming for its head, but the thing moved fast, too fast, dodging with a blur and slashing back. Carice moved then, a silver streak in the dark. She tackled the assassin, her hands flaring with light, and a pulse of energy erupted from her palms, slamming the creature into the wall. It hit with a crack, slumping motionless, but the glow on her skin intensified, bathing the room in a surreal shimmer. She turned to Eli, breathing hard, her eyes wild and blue and burning. "More," she gasped, staggering toward him. "They're close." Her suit was torn further now, a rip across her thigh revealing more of that silver flesh. And the sight hit him like a punch, beauty and danger tangled together. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the shop, but her touch was fire, igniting that hum in his chest again. "Move!" he barked, shoving her behind a stack of tires as another shadow flickered outside. His head spun, torn between the threat and the way her closeness was unraveling him. She pressed against him in the tight space, her body soft and searing, and he felt her heartbeat through his shirt, fast, erratic, matching his own. "Eli," she whispered, her lips brushing his ear, unintentional but devastating. "I need you. Now." Her hand slid to his chest, fingers splaying wide, and the patterns on her skin pulsed harder, brighter, snaking up her arm like vines. He felt them, faint echoes of those same lines tingling under his own skin, a mirror to hers. "Not the time," he snapped, but his voice cracked, raw with the strain of holding back. The air crackled between them, thick with heat and something deeper, something that clawed at his control. Another hiss sounded, closer, and he spun, wrench raised, as a second assassin slipped through the broken window, blade gleaming. Kaeris moved first this time, shoving Eli aside with surprising strength. Her hands flared again, energy bursting forth in a wave that caught the assassin mid-leap, hurling it into the workbench. Tools scattered, metal clanging, and the thing crumpled, but not before its blade grazed her side. She stumbled, a thin line of green blood welling up, and Eli caught her as she fell, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Damn it, Kaeris," he growled, lowering her to the floor behind the tires. Her weight pressed against him, her head lolling back, and her hair spilled over his arm, silk and shadow. The wound wasn't deep, but her glow flickered, unstable, and her breath came in shallow gasps. "You're hurt. Stay down." "No," she rasped, grabbing his shirt, pulling him closer. Her eyes locked with his, fierce despite the pain. "The heat, it's too much. I can't fight them alone." Her fingers tightened, nails digging into his chest, and the hum in his skin surged, a current linking them. "You're part of this. You feel it." He did. God help him, he did. It wasn't just her touch now. It was inside him, a pull that thrummed through his veins, wild and alive. Her silver patterns pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and when her hand slid up to his neck, brushing the pulse point there, a spark jumped, literal blue, arcing between them. He sucked in a breath, the sensation rocking him, raw and overwhelming. "Kaeris," he said, voice rough, almost pleading. "We're in the middle of a damn fight." "And I'm losing," she shot back, her voice breaking as she pressed herself closer, her thigh brushing his. The contact was electric, a jolt that made his vision blur, and he felt the heat of her need, mirrored in his own tightening grip. "Bond with me, Eli, or we both burn." Before he could answer, the back door exploded inward, splinters flying as a third assassin stepped through. This one was bigger, its gray skin scarred with black runes, its blade longer and crackling with red energy. Eli shoved Kaeris down, lunging to his feet, wrench swinging. The assassin parried with its blade, the impact jarring his arm, and he stumbled back, crashing into a shelf. Cans and bolts rained down, and the thing advanced, red eyes glowing like coals. Kaeris surged up behind him, her glow blinding now, and thrust her hands forward. A blast of silver energy slammed into the assassin, driving it through the wall and out into the desert, where it landed in a heap of dust and twisted metal. She collapsed against Eli, her body trembling, and he caught her again, his arms locking around her as they sank to the floor. Her face was inches from his, her breath ragged, her lips parted. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound, desperate and raw. "It's not over. They'll come again." Her hand cupped his jaw, her touch searing and the patterns on her skin flared, spreading to his fingertips where they touched. "Please." He stared at her, chest heaving, the world narrowing to her blue eyes, her heat, the way she fit against him. The assassins were still out there. He could hear faint hisses in the distance, but right now, it was her. Only her. And that hum in his blood, that pull, was louder than any warning. "Okay," he said, the word tearing out of him, rough and final. "Okay." Her lips crashed into his, a collision of fire and need, and the workshop dissolved into light. Her light, their light, swirling around them as the desert held its breath. The kiss ignited something wild, a storm breaking loose in the dim wreckage of the workshop. Kairi's lips were soft but fierce against Eli's, a heat that seared through him like a live wire, pulling him under. Her hands clutched his shoulders, nails biting into his shirt, and the silver patterns on her skin flared, bright, blinding, swirling across her arms and chest like molten light. Eli's hands found her waist, gripping hard, and the hum in his blood roared to life, syncing with hers in a rhythm that drowned out the chaos around them. The air crackled, electric and alive, as if the desert itself held its breath. He pulled back, gasping, his forehead pressed to hers, their breaths tangling in the tight space between them. Her blue eyes burned into his, pupils wide and flickering, and the glow from her skin cast shadows across his face. Shadows that danced with faint echoes of her patterns, now tracing his own hands. "Cairis," he rasped, voice raw. "What the hell was that?" She didn't answer with words. Her fingers slid to his jaw, tracing the line of it with a touch that sent sparks racing down his spine, and she pressed closer, her body molding to his. The torn suit hugged her tighter, the rip at her thigh brushing against his jeans, and the heat of her, God, the heat, was everywhere, sinking into him, unraveling him. "The bond," she whispered, her voice husky, trembling with need. "It begins." Eli's head spun, torn between the fire in his veins and the distant hiss of danger still lurking outside. The assassins were down, sprawled in the dust, but he knew it wasn't over. Her words from before echoed in his skull. "They'll come again." Yet here she was, pressed against him, her scent flooding his senses, wild sage and something sharper, electric, and all he could think about was the way her touch lit him up inside. "We can't," he said, but his hand betrayed him, sliding up her back, feeling the curve of her spine beneath that silver skin. "Not now. They're still out there." "They are," she agreed, her lips brushing his again, feather-light but devastating. "But this," her hand pressed over his heart, where the hum pulsed strongest, and a jolt shot through him, sharp and deep, making his knees buckle. "This cannot wait." Her glow intensified, the patterns swirling faster, and he felt it. Faint lines tingling, strike through, like vines creeping up his arms, faint but real, glowing where their skin met. Eli groaned, low and rough, and pulled her tighter, his resolve crumbling. "You're killing me, Cairis." His fingers dug into her hips, the heat of her seeping through his clothes, and she arched into him, a soft sound escaping her throat, half gasp, half plea, that set his blood on fire. "Then save me," she murmured, her lips grazing his neck, her breath hot against his skin. "Save us." Her hand slid under his shirt, palms flat against his chest, and the contact was a shockwave, her energy surging into him, wild and untamed, fusing with his own. The workshop faded, the broken glass and scattered tools blurring into nothing, and all that remained was her heat, her light, her need. He lifted her, staggering back until her back hit the wall, the impact jarring but not enough to stop her. She wrapped her legs around him, the torn suit riding up, and the friction of her against him was too much, too perfect. Her silver skin glowed brighter, the patterns spiraling across her thighs, her arms, her neck, and he felt them, felt himself, changing, the hum turning into a current, alive and electric, binding them together. "Eli," she breathed, her voice breaking, and her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him down. Their lips crashed again, hungry, desperate, and the energy between them flared. A feedback loop of sensation, her pleasure echoing in him, his in her, until he couldn't tell where he ended and she began. The wall creaked under their weight, dust falling around them, but he didn't care, couldn't care, not when she was this close, this real. Her fingers traced his spine, nails scraping lightly, and the patterns on her skin leapt to his, faint silver lines blooming across his chest, his arms, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. He pulled back just enough to look at her, chest heaving, and saw it. His own skin glowing, faint but unmistakable, a mirror to hers. "What's happening?" he managed, voice wrecked, his hand still gripping her thighs. "The bond," she said, her eyes locked on his, blue and endless and fierce. "It's complete." Her hand slid to his chest, pressing over the new markings, and a wave of heat rolled through him. Not just hers now, but theirs shared. "You're mine, Eli Calderon, and I am yours." He should have been scared, should have been running from this, whatever this was, but all he felt was her, the weight of her in his arms, the fire in his blood, the way she looked at him like he was the only thing keeping her alive. "Guess I'm in deep now," he said, a crooked grin tugging at his lips, and she laughed, a sound like starlight, bright and free, that made his chest ache. But the moment shattered. A low rumble shook the workshop, faint at first, then louder, too loud. Eli tensed, his grip on Kaeris tightening, and she stiffened, her glow dimming slightly. "They're back," she whispered, fear threading through her voice, and he set her down, both of them turning toward the sound. Outside, the desert trembled. Dust swirled in the afternoon light, and a shadow loomed on the horizon. Not one figure, but several, taller, broader, their outlines jagged with armor and weapons that glinted red. Eli's stomach dropped. These weren't the assassins from before. Those had been fast, sleek, deadly. These were something else. Bigger, meaner. "Kaeris," he said, stepping in front of her, his voice steady despite the dread clawing at him. "Who are they?" She moved beside him, her hand finding his, their new markings pulsing together. "General Tormac," she said, her tone cold hard. "Leader of the rebellion. He wants me dead, or worse." Her blue eyes flicked to his, fierce despite the fear. "He's here for the bond, for what we've become." Eli cursed, scanning the shop for anything, tools, a weapon, something to fight with. The wrench was gone, lost in the chaos, but he spotted a crowbar half buried under a pile of debris. He grabbed it, the weight solid in his hand, and turned back to her. "Guess we're not getting a honeymoon." Her lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through. "Not yet." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, and the hum flared again, stronger now, sharper. "But we fight together. The bond, its power. Use it." Before he could ask what she meant, the first figure charged, a hulking shape in black armor, its face hidden behind a visor that glowed crimson. Eli swung the crowbar, aiming for its head, but the thing caught it mid-strike, twisting with inhuman strength. He stumbled, pain shooting through his arm, and then Kaeris was there, her hands flaring with silver light, a blast of energy slamming into the attacker. It staggered back, armor smoking but didn't fall. "Shit," Eli muttered, pulling her behind the workbench as two more advanced, blades drawn, their red eyes locked on her. "They're tough. They're enhanced," she said, pressing against him, her breath ragged. "Tormac's elite, but we're stronger now." Her hand gripped his, and the markings on his skin flared, brighter, hotter, and he felt it, a surge, raw and untamed, coursing through him like a shot of adrenaline spiked with lightning. He stood, pulling her up with him, and faced the attackers. "Let's test that theory," he said, voice low, and the hum in his blood turned to a roar. He thrust his hand forward, instinct guiding him, and a pulse of silver energy, his energy, shot out, mirroring hers. It hit the nearest soldier square in the chest, sending it crashing through the wall in a spray of dust and metal. Carrie stared at him, eyes wide, then smiled, sharp, dangerous, beautiful. "Good," she said, her hand tightening on his. Again, They fought together, side by side, her blasts weaving with his, silver light cutting through the dark. The soldiers were relentless, blades slashing, armor deflecting. But the bond gave them an edge, a rhythm that synced their movements, their breaths, their power. One went down, then another, until the workshop was a graveyard of twisted metal and smoking rubble. But the rumble didn't stop. Through the shattered wall, a final figure emerged, taller, broader, its armor etched with jagged runes that glowed blood red. General Tormak. His visor slid back, revealing a face scarred and gray, eyes burning with hate as they fixed on Kaeris. "Princess," he snarled, voice deep and guttural. "You've defiled our bloodline. I'll purge you, and your pet, myself." Eli stepped forward, crowbar raised, the markings on his skin blazing. "Try it," he said, and the desert night erupted in fire and light. General Tormak's blade sliced through the air, a streak of red energy that hummed with menace. Eli dove to the side, the crowbar slipping from his sweat-slick hand as the weapon grazed the wall behind him, leaving a smoking gash in the concrete. Kaeris lunged forward, her silver light flaring, and thrust her hands out, a blast of energy slamming into Tormak's chest. The general staggered, his armor absorbing the hit with a dull crackle, but his snarl widened, teeth bared like a predator savoring the hunt. "You're weak, princess," Tormak spat, straightening, his massive frame towering over the wrecked workshop. "Tainting our blood with this." His red eyes flicked to Eli, disgust curling his lip. "Pathetic creature. I'll end you both." Eli scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging, the markings on his skin burning brighter, silver threads pulsing in sync with Kaeris' glow. "Keep talking," he growled, snatching a jagged piece of rebar from the debris. "Makes it easier to hit you." He charged, swinging the makeshift weapon, but Tormak batted it aside with a flick of his blade, the force sending Eli sprawling into a pile of twisted metal. Kaeris cried out, her voice sharp with fury, and unleashed another wave of light. This one caught Tormak off guard, driving him back a step, his boots skidding on the concrete. She moved to Eli's side, pulling him up, her hands searing where they touched his arms. "Together," she said, breathless, her blue eyes locked on his. "We're stronger together." He nodded, the hum in his blood roaring louder, and gripped her hand. The contact was a jolt, her energy surging into him, raw and electric, amplifying his own. The markings on his skin flared, spreading up his neck, and he felt it, power, real power, flowing between them like a current with no end. "Let's finish this," he said, voice steady despite the chaos. They faced Tormak as one, hands clasped, their glow merging into a single, blinding force. Eli thrust his free hand forward, instinct guiding him, and a bolt of silver energy shot out, thicker, sharper than before. Kaeris mirrored him, her blast weaving with his, and the combined strike hit Tormak square in the chest. The general roared, his armor cracking under the impact, shards flying as he crashed through the far wall, landing in a heap outside. Dust billowed, the desert wind howling through the gaping hole, but Tormak wasn't done. He rose, slower this time, his visor shattered, revealing a face twisted with rage and pain. "You'll die for this," he snarled, raising his blade, red energy sparking wildly. "Your bond is an abomination." "Then come get us." Eli shot back, stepping in front of Kaeris, his markings pulsing with every heartbeat. She pressed against his back, her hand sliding to his shoulder, and the heat of her steadied him, a lifeline in the storm. "Now, Kaeris," he said, and they struck again, silver light exploding from their joined will, a torrent that swallowed Tormak whole. The general's scream cut off as the energy consumed him, his armor disintegrating, his form collapsing into ash and smoke. Silence fell, heavy and sudden, broken only by the faint crackle of small fires licking at the debris. Eli's chest heaved, his arm trembling as he lowered it, the glow on his skin fading to a soft shimmer. Kaeris slumped against him, her breath ragged, her silver patterns flickering like dying stars. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible, and he turned, catching her as her knees buckled. Her face was pale, the green blood from her earlier wound seeping through her suit again, but her eyes still burned, blue and fierce and alive. "Yeah," he said, easing her to the floor, his hands gentle despite the adrenaline still pumping through him. "We did." He brushed her hair back, the strands clinging to his fingers, and the hum between them softened, a quiet pulse that felt right. "You okay?" She nodded, weak but sure, her hand finding his chest, resting over the faint markings now etched there. "Better," she murmured, her lips curving faintly. "With you." Eli exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping him, and leaned back against the workbench, pulling her closer. The workshop was a ruin, walls breached, tools scattered, glass glinting in the dust, but they were alive. Together, the bond hummed between them, a thread he couldn't see but could feel, tying them in ways he didn't fully understand yet. But the desert wasn't done with them. A low whine pierced the silence, a mechanical hum, growing louder, closer. Eli tensed, his grip on Kaeris tightening, and she sat up, her glow flaring faintly as she turned toward the sound. "More," she said, fear threading through her voice. Tormac's vanguard was just the start. "Son of a bitch," Eli muttered, standing and pulling her up with him. He scanned the wreckage, spotting his Jeep through the broken wall, still intact, keys in the ignition. "We're not sticking around for round two." "Come on." She nodded, leaning on him as they stumbled toward the vehicle, her heat seeping into him, steadying him even now. The whine grew into a roar, and through the dust, he saw them. 3 sleek, black ships cresting the dunes, their hulls glinting like obsidian under the fading sun. Hunters. More of Tormac's rebellion, come to finish what he couldn't. Eli shoved Kaeris into the passenger seat, slamming the door before vaulting into the driver's side. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, and he floored it, tires spinning in the sand as they fishtailed out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the ships descended, beams of red light cutting through the dusk, scorching the ground where they'd been seconds before. "Where to?" he shouted over the engine, glancing at her. Her glow was dim, her face tight with pain, but her hand found his thigh, gripping hard, and the hum flared again, stronger, sharper. "West," she said, voice firm despite the strain. "There's a place, an outpost. Old, hidden. We can hold them there." Eli nodded, swerving onto the highway, the desert blurring past as the ships closed in. The bond pulsed between them, a lifeline in the chaos, and he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, or not at all. The Jeep tore through the desert night, headlights slicing through the dark as Eli pushed the engine to its limit. Sand sprayed behind them, the roar of the motor drowning out the whine of the black ships trailing too close. Kairi sat rigid beside him, her silver glow flickering like a candle in the wind, her hand still on his thigh, anchoring them both. The markings on his skin pulsed with hers, faint but steady, a reminder of the bond now tying their fates together. "They're gaining," she said, her voice tight, her blue eyes scanning the horizon. "Faster than Tormac's scouts. These are enforcers, elite." She winced, pressing a hand to her side where green blood seeped through her torn suit, staining her fingers. "Hold on," Eli said, teeth gritted as he yanked the wheel, veering off the highway onto a rutted dirt track. The Jeep bounced hard, suspension groaning, but the move bought them a moment. The ships overshot, their red beams carving useless trenches in the sand. "This outpost, how far?" 10 miles, she replied, her breath shallow. "Buried under a mesa. My people built it centuries ago. Observation, not war. It's our best chance." Her hand tightened on his leg, her heat sinking into him, and he felt a flicker of her strength through the bond, enough to keep him focused. 10 miles, he muttered, dodging a boulder as the ships swung back into pursuit. "We can make that." He glanced at her, her silver skin pale under the dashboard lights. and his chest tightened. "You good?" She nodded, faint but fierce. "I'll hold. With you, I'll hold." Her eyes met his, blue and endless, and the hum between them surged, a quiet promise in the chaos. The mesa loomed ahead, a flat-topped shadow against the star-strewn sky, and Eli aimed for it, the jeep rattling over uneven ground. The ships fired again, beams lancing closer, and one clipped the rear bumper, sending a jolt through the frame. "Shit!" he yelled, swerving as sparks flew, the smell of scorched metal filling the air. "There!" Kairis pointed, her voice sharp. A narrow crevice split the mesa's base, barely wide enough for the jeep. Eli didn't hesitate. He gunned it, tires screaming as they squeezed through, rocks scraping the sides with a shriek. The ships pulled up, too large to follow, their beams slashing uselessly at the stone. Inside, the crevice opened into a cavern, cool and dark, the jeep's headlights glinting off smooth, metallic walls. Alien, ancient, untouched by time. Eli killed the engine, silence crashing over them, broken only by their ragged breathing. Kairis slumped in the seat, her glow dimming, and he reached for her, pulling her close. "We're here," he said, his hand brushing her hair, the strands soft and warm against his fingers. "What now?" She straightened, slow but determined, and pointed to a panel embedded in the wall, its surface etched with faint, glowing runes. "That," she said, sliding out of the jeep with his help. "It's active. I can use it." They stumbled to the panel, her leaning on him, her heat steadying him even as her strength waned. She pressed her palm to it, and the runes flared, silver, like her skin, and the cavern hummed to life. Holographic displays flickered into existence, star maps and alien text scrolling through the air, and a low vibration pulsed through the floor. "It's a comms array," she said, her voice gaining strength as she worked the controls, fingers dancing over the light. "I can signal my allies, those still loyal on Tharun." And she hesitated, glancing at him, her eyes softening. "I can show them us." "Us?" Eli frowned, the markings on his skin tingling as she turned to him, her hand finding his. "Our bond," she said, stepping closer, her glow brightening faintly. "It's proof we're not just prey. We're something new." Her fingers traced his chest, where the silver lines glowed through his torn shirt, and the hum flared, warm and alive, pulling him in. Eli felt the hum deepen as Kairis' fingers lingered on his chest, her touch igniting the silver markings that now traced his skin. The cavern's metallic walls reflected their combined glow, a soft shimmer that pulsed in time with their breaths. Her blue eyes held his, fierce and tender all at once, and for a moment, the roar of the pursuing ships faded. Just her, just them, in this ancient, alien refuge. "Something new," he echoed, his voice rough, a grin tugging at his lips despite the chaos. "Guess that's one way to put it." She smiled, small, fleeting, but real, and turned back to the panel, her hands slipping from his chest to dance over the runes. The holographic displays shifted, star maps spinning into a dizzying array of light, and a low chime echoed through the cavern, sharp and clear. "I'm sending a message," she said, her voice steadying as she worked. "To the loyalists on Tharun. They need to know I'm alive and what we've done." Her glow flared faintly, the green blood on her side, glistening under the light, but she didn't falter. Eli stepped closer, his hand brushing her shoulder, grounding her as much as himself. "And the hunters out there?" he asked, glancing toward the crevice where red beams still flickered in the distance, probing the mesa's edge. "They're not going to wait for your backup." "No," she admitted, her fingers pausing as she met his gaze. "But this outpost has defenses. Old, but functional." She tapped a rune, and the floor shuddered. A deep, mechanical groan rising as hidden panels slid open along the walls, revealing sleek, cylindrical devices that hummed with energy. "Plasma turrets," she said, a hint of pride in her tone. "Enough to hold them off for now." "Good enough," Eli said, nodding as the turrets whirred to life, their barrels glowing faintly blue. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the jeep. "Let's get you patched up while those things do their job." Her heat sank into him again, steady and alive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that every touch was weaving them tighter together, something beyond flesh, beyond reason. They retreated to the back of the cavern, where he found a crate to sit her on, his hands moving fast to dig through the jeep's glove box for a battered first aid kit. She leaned against the wall, her silver skin pale under the strain, and he knelt before her, tearing open a gauze pack. "Hold still," he muttered, pressing it to her side where the green blood still seeped, slow but stubborn. Her hiss was soft, her hand gripping his shoulder, and the hum flared, warm, electric, pulling him in. "Eli," she murmured, her voice low, her fingers tightening as he worked. "You're steady, strong." Her blue eyes softened, tracing his face, and the air thickened, charged with that wild sweetness he couldn't escape. "I didn't expect this." "You." He tied off the gauze, his hands lingering on her waist, the suit's torn edges brushing his fingers. "Yeah, well, I didn't expect a glowing princess dropping into my lap either," he said, a wry edge to his voice. "But here we are." He looked up, caught by her gaze, and the markings on his skin pulsed brighter, mirroring hers. "This bond, it's not letting go, is it?" "No," she whispered, leaning closer, her hair spilling over her shoulder like a dark wave. "It's us now. Forever." Her hand slid to his neck, her touch searing, and he felt it, a flicker of her thoughts, her strength, flowing through him like a current. She was in him, and he was in her, a connection that defied everything he'd known. Before he could respond, the cavern shook, a deep boom as the turrets fired, blue streaks lancing out through the crevice. Eli stood, pulling her up with him, and they moved to the panel, where the holograms now showed 3 black ships circling the mesa, their red beams clashing with the outpost defenses. "They're not backing off," he said, his jaw tight. "We need a plan." Kaeris nodded, her hand still in his, their glow merging as she tapped the panel again. "The signal's out," she said, her voice firm. "My allies will come, if they can. But there's more." She hesitated, her blue eyes flickering with something unspoken, then pressed a rune that shifted the display. A scan of her body, alien symbols pulsing over a faint, glowing point in her abdomen. Eli frowned, squinting at the image. "What's that?" She turned to him, her hand finding his chest again, resting over his heart. "Our child," she said, soft but sure, and the words hit him like a freight train. "The bond, it's complete. And it's created this." His breath stopped, his mind reeling. "A kid?" He managed, staring at her, then the scan, then back. "You're pregnant?" "Now." "Yes," she said, her glow brightening, a faint smile breaking through. "Part human, part Tharun. The first." Her fingers traced his markings, and the hum surged, warm and alive, a thread tying them to something bigger. "It changes everything, Eli." "Damn right it does," he said, a laugh bubbling up, shaky but real. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, and she melted into him, her heat sinking deep. "Guess we're in it for the long haul." The turrets fired again, the cavern trembling, and the holograms flickered, new signatures approaching, fast from the sky. Kaeris pulled back, her eyes widening as she checked the display. "My allies," she breathed, relief flooding her voice. "They're here." Outside, the night erupted, silver ships descending, their sleek forms clashing with the black enforcers in a storm of light and sound. Eli and Kaeris watched from the crevice, her hand in his, their markings pulsing as the battle unfolded. The Loyalists were outnumbered but fierce, their blasts tearing through the rebellion's ranks, and within minutes, the black ships retreated, trails of smoke marking their escape. Silence settled, broken by the hum of the silver ships landing near the mesa. A tall figure emerged, Tharun, like Kaeris, but older, his silver skin etched with gold patterns, his eyes a calm gray. "Princess," he called, stepping into the cavern, his voice deep and steady. You live. Admiral Kale, she said, stepping forward, Eli at her side. Edo. And I'm not alone. She gripped his hand, their glow flaring, and Kale's gaze shifted to Eli. Then the markings, his expression unreadable. Your father's murderer is dead, Kale said, his tone softening. Tormac's rebellion crumbles. But this, he gestured to their joined hands, the silver lines pulsing between them. This is unexpected. It's more than that, Kari said, her voice ringing clear. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, and Kale's eyes widened as she explained. The bond, the child, the bridge between worlds. We're not just survivors. With a future. Kale studied them, then nodded, a faint smile breaking his stern face. Then we negotiate. With Tharun and your Earth. He turned to Eli, offering a hand. You've earned that much, human. Eli took it, the grip firm, and grinned. Call me Eli. Months later, the workshop stood rebuilt. Not just steel and concrete now, but infused with Tharun tech, its walls shimmering faintly under the Nevada sun. The desert buzzed with life, trucks stopping by, curious locals mingling with off-world visitors, a strange new harmony taking root. Eli and Kaeris lived above it, a rooftop deck offering views of the endless dunes and the stars beyond. One evening, they stood there, her swollen belly pressing against him as he wrapped an arm around her. He's kicking, she murmured, guiding his hand to feel the movement, strong, insistent, a promise of what was to come. Like his mom, Eli said, pulling her closer, her heat a comfort he'd never tire of. Stubborn as hell. She laughed, her glow blending with his, and they looked up, ships streaking across the sky, human and Tharun, a fragile piece holding strong. Their child, born of two worlds, would grow here, a bridge forged in fire and love, a testament to what courage and connection could build.